Okay. Good evening, everyone. We're continuing our study of In Divine Friendship by Swami Kriyananda. We're actually quite toward the end of the book. It'll be a few more weeks, but we made it through. It's always a miracle. Time is always a miracle to me. We go through that many pages. We're up to class 58, so I shouldn't really be surprised. So let's pray together. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Dear friend Swami Kriyananda, help us to understand the deeper inspiration and meaning behind the words that you have written here. Help us to understand how Master was working through you, what your deeper intentions are, that all of us may grow quickly and happily into great beings of light, which is our true destiny. Om, peace. Amen. Let's just take a moment of meditation and then we'll start. Om, peace. Amen. All right. We are in the section of this book which is called a Self-Realization Fellowship, and I am skipping a lot of the pages in this book because it's very detailed about very complicated events, and if I really read every letter in here, we'd be at it for another 3 months, and that's just a little more time than I want to put on this. However, the letters I'm skipping are very, very interesting. So if you have the book or don't have the book and want to read, by all means, I recommend it. It's just a very specific study, which at least I myself explained in great detail in the book Light Bearer. And it's just a more comprehensive way for you to read it. And I also, a couple of classes ago, I gave the long summary. So I think it's sufficiently covered. I'm justifying it. Okay. This letter was written in December 1994, just before Christmas, December 23rd. I recall the last class I had. I set the stage for this, that Swamiji had been served with the papers for what turned out to be the lawsuit. We tend to call it the sexual harassment lawsuit because this woman, Anne Marie Bertolucci, accused a man in the community of taking advantage of her. And then in order to sweep all of Ananda into it, she claimed that it was the pattern and practice of Ananda to be abusive to women. One of the reasons why the whole thing did not go so well for us, including the fact that we made an unfortunate choice in our lawyer, was that it was so preposterous. We actually we just didn't imagine it could ever get traction. We were very naive. We were not so naive when it was over. So at Thanksgiving of 1994, Swami and we were served with the papers on that lawsuit. SRF had already lost everything. I explained all that last time. This was a final effort on the part of SRF, whom we eventually tied directly to this lawsuit, even though their name wasn't on it, to take Ananda down by scandal, and also hopefully to prove that if Ananda was morally reprehensible, then any association in the mind of the public between SRF and Ananda would tarnish the reputation of SRF, and therefore all the exclusive rights that they had lost, they had a slim chance of getting back. I think the real intention was just to bankrupt Ananda and to humiliate and eviscerate, and it didn't work. The outcome of the trial was not in our favor, but it didn't matter. Truth was on our side, and we just went through it. Now, having said all of that, on December 6th or 7th, which was scarcely just a week or two after this, Swami went, actually might have been the middle of the month, he went in, let me say this straight. He had a doctor's appointment soon after. And the doctor wanted to hospitalize him immediately because he felt his heart was so impaired that he was in danger of dropping dead at any moment. Swami had made a commitment to record a cable television show in Palo Alto in the middle of the month. And I think that he allowed himself to be checked into the hospital, but a few days later he insisted on coming down to Palo Alto to record the television show. Then he went back to the hospital and had the heart surgery. I know when he had the heart surgery because this letter is written on December 23rd, and it was written a week after he was in the hospital and had this experience. So it was a incredibly intense time. Swami had a heart valve replacement. So it was more than just what some people have where they get a stent put in or something. They actually cut into his heart and replaced a piece of his heart, which later he said he's not sure if he had it to do over again, he would do it over, because cutting into the heart like that had a deep effect. But he lived another 20 plus years, so I'm really glad that he did it, almost 30 years more. So we had been 4 years in this intense struggle with SRF about the future of Master's work. Their concept of it was that there would be one institution that would represent, there would be a few individuals who would represent, and that would be that, and everybody else would be sort of be subservient to that perspective. Our point of view, as I've explained before, was that every disciple has the same divine potential to be an instrument of the Guru. It doesn't mean that every disciple is, but we don't organize it institutionally and authoritatively in board of directors-y and hierarchy like that, because in the eyes of God and Guru, we're all the same. And Swami felt that Master's work was so much bigger than one institution that it was criminal to try to hold it to one institution. Needless to say, SRF did not agree. In his 1994 Christmas letter, this is the summary of this, to the Ananda community, Swamiji describes a deep spiritual experience he had while recovering from open heart surgery. This is an excerpt from that letter. Dear ones, last Sunday night in the hospital, I became aware of an actual force trying to bring Yogananda's work downward, to confine it in the pettiness of definitions and formal organization. And I felt a mighty force combat this pettiness to open up his teachings and mission, that it become a doorway to the new age of Dwapara, which is to say the age of energy. So even though there were two institutions and there were two organizations and there were two individuals, you had Self-Realization Fellowship on this side and Ananda on the other, and there was a lawsuit being filed in this way and spokespeople for each side who disagreed. Swami felt that those details were just these great forces reduced down to these tiny specifics. That what was actually going on was this cosmic struggle, that Yogananda was there to break the world out of Kali Yuga and bring in the age of energy. The concept that was being presented against Ananda's idea was that that Master's work could be reduced and defined in one form. This is Kali Yuga personified. This is the Catholic Church exactly. We are the representatives of Jesus. This church is the real church. And that was more or less what was being propounded. And Swami said when he was lying in that hospital bed that he saw it way beyond the details of it. He just saw these two forces. One is trying to draw the greatness of Master into a tiny little receptacle. The other force is trying to bust all forms and receptacles with the power of God. It occurred to me to write an article for a magazine, Yogananda's Mission and Yours. His work, you see, isn't personal at all. Wait just a second. Excuse me, I skipped a paragraph. I prayed deeply until well after 1 a.m., trying to attune myself more deeply to this expansive power. And I felt that that expansiveness will win. It must win. I also felt that it is quite impersonal, caring not a whit for forms, persons, positions, dogmas, that whoever tunes into it, no matter what that person's spiritual path, will serve as an instrument for this great wave of divine light and energy that is sweeping over the planet. So far from seeing it as Yogananda's mission, Yogananda's church, Yogananda's teachings, Swamiji saw it as this huge, expansive force of light, of which Yogananda is a part. He may be a leader in that, but it's a force of light, and it's so much bigger than our human definitions, that whether you call yourself a disciple of Master or a devotee of Ananda or part of SRF or a Buddhist or a Christian or a Hindu or an atheist, those are just tiny, tiny little labels put on top of this vast consciousness that if we tune into the power of that light will work through us. And what we call it matters not at all to the light. It's just the expression of light that matters. It occurred to me to write an article for a magazine, Yogananda's Mission and Yours. His work, you see, isn't personal at all. Yogananda wasn't personal. As he put it repeatedly, God is the Guru. His teachings weren't personal. God was using him as the avatar of a new age to change an entire civilization. Swami often has gone back to this way of understanding it. This is Babaji and Jesus who have planned the salvation of this age, who are working with global trends, and any little temporary label that's put on it is nothing compared to the power of that trend. And even Master himself, we do him a great disservice when we say Master's this and Master's that, and this was his way, and this is what Yogananda wanted. Maybe, and in fact he did, and that devotion for the disciple, for his own guru, is beautiful to behold. But we have to also listen, and this is what Swamiji always was working with, we have to listen to how Master himself described himself and what he was doing. And whereas many people would put on him this great sort of personal, you are my guru and Yogananda is my guru, Master said, I never call people my disciples. They're God's disciples. And over time, it's become more and more defined by his name. But Master himself never allowed that. And if we're going to actually be his disciples, we have to listen. It is the power of God flowing through him. And that personal devotion, I say again, to our own guru is uplifting to us. But through him, we need to go to what he himself came to bring us. Don't let anyone tell you that one organization, one person, one statement can ever, even remotely, define what Yogananda brought to the world. The present legal tiffs are not between two organizations, but between two different takes on his cosmic mission. The dark forces, I definitely felt them to be dark, want to keep him small, a loving saintlet, the beloved founder of an organization, etc. The forces of light want to use his life mission to change, inspire, and guide all of humanity. Swamiji has made an interesting statement. He said, the time will come, and what that time is, I don't know, when the teachings that Master brought will define all of society. He said, not Master's name, not personal devotion to him, but the vision of life that he brought as energy and about willpower and devotion and attuning to the feminine, to the divine feminine, and taking personal responsibility for our own spiritual welfare and attuning ourselves through the practice of yoga techniques like Kriya. That, it's a great movement of energy that stretches into money magnetism and educating children and community lifestyles and new understandings of marriage and self-expression through art. You can say all of those things, and all of those things can exist as channels of light and ways of uplifting people's consciousness without everybody all the time going, oh, and Yogananda this and Yogananda that. Swami says, of course there will be a great deal of devotion also to him, but the ideas will simply permeate out into society. I use as an example a very interesting just observation in my own life experience, because it's been 50 years since I came to Ananda, and a little bit more than that when I started essentially moving away from the mainstream of society and starting down the direction that brought me to Ananda. And it was yoga, it was devotion, it was Eastern teachings in a Western world, and it was vegetarianism, and it was attunement with nature and back to the land, a lot of those ideas. And a lot of those ideas, which, are related to Master's way of life. And I use the most interesting example is organic foods. Organic foods and unrefined whole foods. Because just 50 years ago, which sounds like long, but really in human history is just a moment, when we started in the late 60s with all of that, just rebelling against processed foods, rebelling against insecticides and all of that, talking about vegetarianism. Veganism wasn't as popular then, but even just to be a vegetarian, people thought we were crazy. And of course, all of those ideas are just central to what Master was teaching also. 50 years later, it's completely mainstream. But nobody thinks about Ananda as causing that. Nobody thinks that Yogananda caused that. And think now about the practice of meditation. I do live in Northern California, which is a pretty advanced part of the world. But my joke here is that by no means does everyone meditate. But those who don't meditate feel guilty because they know they should. I mean, that is just a huge step from when nobody had any idea even what we were doing. And people are not saying Yogananda this, Yogananda that, but he was a major force in bringing that idea to the fore, that we can take personal responsibility and take action for our spiritual lives. There's a great movement in America especially, away from what they call, away from denominationalism, which means the Christian world was always defined by I'm a Lutheran, I'm an Episcopalian, I'm a Methodist, whatever. But now, even Christians look for a church that inspires them. And there's lots of churches around that don't affiliate with any major denomination because they're just drawing their inspiration directly. Of course, they never talk about Yogananda, but he was part of that power, that force of light that spoke about the difference between religion and spirituality. And all the, the popular opinion polls that they do, people are far less religious, but they call themselves, they feel they are more spiritual and less religious, which is spiritual means it's personal between me and God. Religion means there's a form involved. This is the age of energy. We really don't understand how these masters are working. We look at the outward signs of it, and we think what we can see in the physical world with our physical eyes defines what they're doing, but that's not at all true. Master came, Swami described him as like a comet blazing across the sky and just shooting light out in all directions. And, the fragments of that fell to earth everywhere. And they're They are lifetrons, or light bombs is what I would call them. And they were planted in countless individual hearts, and they're still vibrating and drawing people to it. So this, Swamiji says, this is who Yogananda is. And yes, there's an organization founded in his name, and they're deeply devoted to him, and they do wonderful work, and they make great spiritual progress. And that's as it should be. But to say that's all he came to bring, is this one organization, the president of which is the sole spokesman for this comet shooting across the heavens? So this was Swami's great revelation lying in the hospital bed after open heart surgery. There are these two forces, this powerful, expansive force of light, and this, we want to keep it under our control energy. And Swami felt so strongly about this after this, the day after before he wrote this letter, the day after or 2 days after he had this vision in the hospital, he telephoned all of us who were within driving distance of where he was. He was in Sacramento at that point. He had us all come to see him because he wanted to tell us. He wanted us to understand what he had perceived. We drove 2 hours, sat with him for an hour and a half, and then drove back because he just said, he said what he wanted to say. Then he said, I'm convalescing from major surgery. I'm not here for a social time. But he said, I wanted you to hear it from me. So it was really quite a moment in time. So let's go on. Don't let anyone tell you, the dark forces, and there we are. It is a glorious work, Swami writes, one so important and so great that we as individuals count for nothing at all, except as we offer our lives to the service of divine love. Okay, so that was only part of what he wrote as a Christmas letter to us, wanting to inspire us. Of course, it was a challenging time at Ananda, and Swami's heart surgery, it was a big moment. But he wanted to inspire us with faith in what we were doing, because we were in this middle of this legal battle, which went on for a total of 12 years. We were only at year 4. We had no idea how much longer we had to go. And we'd just been served with this really ugly lawsuit. And it just, it was a time when Swamiji really needed us to understand that we were part of something that was of cosmic importance, and we needed to straighten our spines and persevere, which we did, thank God. Okay, that was the end of that letter. Now on January 5th, this is December 23rd when he wrote that, on January 5th of 1995, just the year later, Swami apparently received a letter criticizing what he had said, that section of that letter. So he's responding to a former Ananda member, now a supporter of SRF, who criticized his 1994 Christmas letter, particularly the excerpt quoted above. So Swami writes, and I don't know who this was, who he was writing to. I have no idea. Swami writes, I wrote of universal principles. You've personalized my statement by making it seem boastful. I would never say, I represent the truth. I have a right and a duty, however, to say, I believe I perceive the truth of the matter and am doing my best to attune myself to that truth. You see how different that is? Swamiji was always so subtle. Of course you would read that, and he talks about the force of light and the force of darkness, and what he perceived to be the light force is the side that he has aligned himself with, and all of Ananda is aligned with. So this person says, you say that you represent the truth. And Swami said, I would never say that. But I would say that I recognize the truth. And having recognized the truth, I do my best to be an instrument of that truth. See, there's a subtle difference that may be lost on the correspondent here. I have it right. No, that's not what Swami said. He said there are two forces at play here. And one of them is expansive and one of them is contractive. And I believe the expansive is the one, and I'm going to do everything I can to give it power. It's quite different. Master wrote in the autobiography that even masters can make minor errors of judgment concerning principles, errors for which their gurus may reprimand them. It is wise always to look at the principles involved and not only at the persons who are trying to exemplify those principles. This is, again, the way Swami always tried to say it. He never said to us, I ought to know, I know, Master told me, this is right. He never said that. He would explain to us what the principle was and why he thought it was true. And then he would commit himself to that principle, but it was the principle that he was asking us to commit ourselves to. And yes, we would be in his company doing it, but he wasn't saying, I know you have to do what I say. He was saying, I believe this is true, and I invite you to come with me. So he said, the argument, don't you think so-and-so ought to know best, is a weak argument, if only because it demands a suspension of normal reason and common sense. That's a reference. The argument, what would you say, the disagreement between Dayamata, who was a direct disciple of Master, and at that time the president of SRF. She had been with Master since she was 17 years old. She was a very loyal disciple to her guru. She was the president of SRF for 50 years or something like that. Master's spiritual successor was Rajasi, Janakananda, an American man. He only lived 3 years. He got a brain tumor. Dayamata was the next president. She was not Master's direct successor, nor his spiritual heir in that sense, but she ruled SRF for a long time. And when Swami would disagree with her, or any of us would disagree with her, her response was, I was with him for so many years, don't you think I ought to know? And so instead of it being like Swami would tell us, this is the principle, this is how I understand it, this is the teachings, this is how I apply it, she would say, I was with him for a long time, don't you think I ought to know? We never knew what to say about that. Yes, you ought to know, but it doesn't mean you do. Why don't you explain to us why you think what you're saying is true? We were very confused when we met Dayamata, which we did on a number of occasions, because Swami was so conversational. You know, we would discuss back and forth. She was declaratory. Just that was basically the way they operated. So apparently this correspondent said, Dayamata disagrees with you, don't you think she ought to know? Swami says that's just not, it's a weak argument at best, because you have nothing else to say, and he says, because it demands the suspension of normal reason and common sense. You're not allowed to use it. You just have to acquiesce, because don't you think she ought to know? Swami just thought it was bad training for discipleship. I mean, quite in addition to the fact that he wasn't persuaded by her principles, he didn't feel it was the way devotees should be trained. Devotees should be taught to use their reason and use their common sense and be given the food and the fuel and the context in order to do that. And that was how Swami always worked with us. Oh, true, if Master, who was always compassionate, were to appear unfeeling in a certain circumstance, the proper reaction of a disciple would be to say, I must not have understood him in this instance. So when you see your guru whom you believe doing something that seems quite uncharacteristic, but you have all these other experiences that cause you to have faith in him, you might doubt your own perception before you start saying that he's wrong. If even a saint, however, shows himself too often to be unfeeling and too seldom compassionate, the disciple would be justified in asking himself whether the actions are not truer to the person than his own devout expectations of that person. Now that is a very subtle thought he's putting forth. You know, once or twice you can say, well, I don't understand. But if someone that you revere as a highly evolved soul consistently behaves in a way that contradicts the principles that that person ought to be adhering to, it's not being disloyal to stop and ask that maybe I have projected upon this person an expectation that is not valid. And maybe they're showing me who they are. And now I have to decide whether this is sufficient to change my commitment. You know, it's a very good question, and people have to go through it all the time. In the present instance, what is involved are grand and impersonal principles. To boast that one represents such a principle would be, as you say, delusion. To believe in the principle, however, and do everything one can to support and serve it, is the duty of every devotee. So again, Swami's correcting him. You know, Swami never said, I am the personification of this principle. He said, this principle speaks for itself, and I choose to serve it. There's a great deal of difference. If we believe, on the contrary, that because a good person is acting against that principle, therefore the principle itself must be wrong, this belief must be considered a delusion. So what he's saying is, merely because Dhyamata does not see this the way I see it, does not mean that the principle is wrong. And you can't say just because she doesn't agree, therefore the principle must be wrong. It doesn't necessarily follow. She may just disagree. That's all. For surely you will not say that it's right on principle to oppose the universalizing of Master's message. So there he hits it directly. The principle of world-transforming energy in all areas of life, do you think that that wasn't what Master came to bring? Are you against that expansiveness? The two principles of contraction and expansion can be kept in a state of harmony and rest as long as both are accepted as necessary to the total picture of reality. When these two concepts are set at odds with one another, however, it is that conflict, and not the concepts themselves, that raises the question of good and evil. And see, this is what it comes down to. So Ananda has one way of expressing Master's teaching, and SRF has another way. So what? It's a big world. Just go where you're inspired, do what you feel Master wants you to do, and the rest, God will take care of the rest of it. But it's when you say, you can't do what you're doing because you have to do what I'm doing. And it's not the principle then that's wrong. It's trying to impose whatever principle you're following on everyone else. That's where the disharmony comes. I feel that there is a cosmic force which is wholesomely determined to universalize Master's work. To combat that force, rather than letting it work itself out to its natural conclusion, is what I call evil. Because the Master's wanting to expand, and we're trying to not let him. That is to say, the friction resulting from this conflict produces disharmony. I do not say that Dhyamata represents this evil, any more than I say that I represent this good, that she is, I hope with good intentions, acting in support of this obstructive force is, however, I do believe, true. And I see no point in saying she couldn't be supporting it. We can all make mistakes. This is how Swami looked at it. And he spent pages and pages in this book and in many other books explaining the mindset, the karmic conditions, the intentions, all the reasons why a devoted disciple could pick it up from that string, but he never felt that it was the right string, and he felt that she was in error in doing so. One also serves the cause of evil or disharmony when one tries deliberately to harm others. This is especially so when the harm is committed in the name not of truth but of untruth. And here he refers to Anne Marie Bertolucci, who was introduced to the leaders of SRF and strongly supported they strongly supported her attack on Ananda, which was fallacious. To welcome Bertolucci with open arms, for example, and support her in what could only have been and are now revealed to be lies about Ananda is not godly behavior, no matter who the perpetrator is. To encourage treachery to Ananda in the name of loyalty to SRF is again not godly behavior. So Swami never hesitated to call things what they were. I mean, many people would try to soften that blow and make it, more amenable. Let's hold space for everybody's point of view. No, he just said, this was my perception and this is what I believe. And I happen to agree with him. I repeat what I wrote in my Christmas letter. There is something very big trying to happen in Master's mission. If I can be shown that my perception is wrong and can be convinced that it's wrong, I myself will willingly admit my error and change my actions accordingly. In the meantime, however, I cannot accept it as error merely because a fellow disciple tells me I am wrong. Again, you see, this is Swami's way. His way wasn't, I'm the one in charge, you have to listen to me. It was, this is what I'm thinking, this is why I'm thinking it, this is how it looks to me, this appears to be the consequences, this is what I remember Master saying, this is what I saw him do. And then with all of that, we try to come to an intuitive and a rational understanding of what right behavior and right response will be. Not just, you must be wrong, because don't you think she ought to know? Swami just had no patience for that. I too lived with Master. I know what he told me and others. I have every right to my own understanding of his words and teachings, and must insist on that right as preferable in every case over blind acceptance of someone else's understanding, especially when that understanding goes completely counter to everything I myself deeply believe to be true. So this is his answer. The letter obviously said, well, Dayamata disagrees, you should go along with her. He said, no, I'm not. And then he explained why. Okay, now we have just a couple more in this section. There was a reporter from the LA Times, actually, who came to see Swamiji. It might have been just after Dayamata died or just before. But the controversy between SRF and Ananda, no, we're skipping all the way to 2001. Let's see what's happening in 2000. In 2001, the Bertolucci lawsuit has already finished. It finished in 98. There was a judgment against Ananda. It wasn't as bad as it could have been, but it wasn't good. And then the state appeals court returned a small piece of the whole SRF lawsuit, which we thought was finished. SRF had been all these years appealing different aspects, most of which was rejected, but one small copyright issue was returned. We ended up having to have a trial about it. And the whole incredible controversy between Swami Kriyananda and his Gurubhais, who spent 45 years trying to fight against him, including this 12 years of litigation. And Dayamata's name was often mentioned. She was the one. Swamiji said that he felt closer to her spiritually than anyone else in the world. And for the 14 years that he was in SRF, he worked very closely with her. So her determination to destroy his work was very hard on Swami. It was very hard on his heart, and it was a big spiritual test for him. So this Los Angeles Times reporter had interviewed Swamiji, and Swamiji is now answering a question in a letter that he didn't answer in person. This is June 2001. Swami writes, "You asked me during our interview how I could still be a friend to someone who had betrayed me deeply and for so many years. This is because whenever Swami spoke of Dayamata, he spoke of her, he spoke frankly about her, but it wasn't personal. He disagreed with the position she'd taken, but he always said that his love for her was unconditional. and his friendship for her was unchanged. Despite the fact that he had to fight against the position she's taken, he never allowed that to become personal in terms of his friendship for her. So he writes, "You asked me during our interview how I could still be a friend to someone who had betrayed me deeply and for so many years. Since then, I've pondered how to answer you, because I assume you had a sincere desire to know." Swami writes, "There are two kinds of love. The first is given in response to love received. It is conditioned by what it receives. The other is a commitment." As Shakespeare wrote in the sonnet that begins, "Let me not to the marriage of true minds," he continues, "Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds." So what that Shakespeare's line means is, it's not true love if you give your love and then circumstances of that person change and then you withdraw it. He said that's not true love. Okay, Swami says there are two kinds of love. That which is given in response to what you receive, and that love which is simply a commitment to love. Now you can see that this is challenging, isn't it? Love that comes with commitment is one's own to give. It doesn't depend on anyone else's attitudes and behaviors. So there's an interesting point, isn't it? Committed love is completely under your control. If it's responsive love, then you're always going to be subject to somebody else's behavior. You will not have mastery over your own feelings. You will feel love if everything goes your way, and then if that person takes another path than the one you would have chosen for them, then all of a sudden you're not in control anymore. You're completely the victim of their behavior. So committed love means that I'm not diminished by somebody else's actions. The way Dayamata chooses to treat me is her affair, not mine. That's always such an interesting way to put it. You know, the way she chooses to treat me is up to her. It's not up to me. I can't dictate to her how she should behave. She has to make up her own mind how she's going to behave. My feelings, however, are my own responsibility. So in other words, how he responds to her behavior, that's his choice. What she does is her choice. What feelings he has in regard to what she does, that's his choice. Were I to retract them, meaning his feelings of love for her, I myself would suffer more than it would be worth to me. I love the way he puts that. I would suffer more than it would be worth to me. The satisfaction of saying, ha ha, I don't love you anymore. You're not my sister anymore. Ha ha. He said it's just the loss to him would be too great because he would become smaller. He would become he would become a slave to her responses. He would no longer be a channel for the unconditional love of God, all for the satisfaction of saying, ha ha, you misbehaved. I'm not going to love you anymore. I love the way he puts that, more than it's worth to me. I would lose so much, it's just not worth it. Were I to allow myself to be angry or to hate, I would cheapen myself. That's also interesting, isn't it? You know, to respond with anger because you've behaved so badly, I make myself just well, it's an interesting word, I cheapen myself. Here we are, we're trying to be instruments of God. Here we are, children of God. Here we are, disciples of a great master, and I'm just going to be mad at you because you didn't do what I wanted you to do. It violates the divine dignity of our own nature. By loving instead, I feel calmness, inner joy, and a wish to help her if I can. And Swami strove literally to the last days of his life and the last days of her life to try to communicate to her the principles by which he was acting in the hope that she would recognize them and embrace them herself. He did not succeed. What's happened since both of them have left the planet, I couldn't say. But in this world, it never came to resolution. Then he says, though I feel I must fight back now in defense of the work Master has given me to do, my hope is that even at this late stage of her life, Dayamata's life, she may recognize her mistake and change. Swami never lost hope. But he didn't feel that loving her meant that he had to go along with her because he thought she was not following the right principle. So he separated their disagreement on principle from the commitment he felt to her as a brother. More than that, I feel it is my duty to defend this work, for it isn't mine, and my determination to defend it is not for myself. It is to persevere in my duty. Master had given him a work to do, and the mere fact that Dayamata thought he shouldn't do it, she was not his guru. And he did not feel, he felt that Master wanted him to continue, and so part of continuing simply was to defy her. But he didn't have to dislike her for it, or he didn't have to withdraw his love. As Swami put it, though, he said, if you hold out your hand in friendship to someone and they consistently bat it aside, he said, you may keep your hand in your pocket. But that doesn't mean you have withdrawn your friendship. It just means you have withdrawn your hand. And that's how he often talked about this. He had to fight, and he fought very hard. And at times he had to talk about her in ways that were not complimentary, because it was necessary in order to carry on the defense of the work Master had given him to do. But that didn't change him. I asked him, there was this other woman who had been very close with Swami. He had great hope for her spiritually. She did not fulfill that hope, and in fact, in the end, she went and joined SRF, and when we were in the middle of the Bertolucci lawsuit, she testified against Swamiji and just did incalculable damage. I said to Swami later, I said, if she genuinely repented of what she has done and wanted to come back to Ananda, he said, would you welcome her? He said, if she genuinely saw things differently and was sincere in that, he said, of course I would welcome her. But then he said, but I would treat her differently now that I know what she's capable of, meaning now that I know she's capable of treachery. He said, I would not trust her in the same way I trusted her before. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't open the door and give her as many opportunities as she was able to embrace, but I would also protect Ananda from her, because if she's capable of treachery once, she'll do it again. I had a very interesting experience that way. There's this man who was a prominent character in this whole 12-year saga. He was a man who had lived at Ananda and then left and became part of SRF, and he became their like authority on Ananda. So he was super in the middle, and he was not, what can I say? I don't think he was a noble man. He did not behave well. And he just took it upon himself that he was there to see what he could do to tear Ananda down. And he wrote lots of letters and sent mass mailings, and even actually put letters he'd written on the windshields of the cars in the parking lot of our church here in Palo Alto. I mean, he worked really hard to persuade us that we were all wrong and misguided, and that Swami Kriyananda was a treacherous betrayer of Master's work, and we should all turn on him. He didn't succeed, but he tried very hard. And in a certain context, we were all in the same place. And some misguided friend of mine brought this man to me with his wife and wanted us all to be friends now. You know, wanted me to be like magnanimous enough to just let bygones be bygones. And my response, it was actually interesting, none of this was premeditated. I said, have you repudiated the actions that you took? I said, a great many people were hurt by what you did. Have you repented? You want to make it up for all the bad that you did? Have you repudiated? Have you repudiated your past actions? And his wife answered, it was unfortunate that people were hurt. I said, that is clever, but that is not an answer. That is not what I asked you. I asked you if you have changed your point of view. And they hadn't. I said I would be a fool to welcome you back in. Why would I do that? You're just going to come in like a snake and start spreading poison all over. And they had nothing to say in defense because it was true. And, I said, I don't have anything against you, but I'm not going to risk everything again because I know what you're capable of. But honestly, I had nothing against him. I mean, he was just himself. He had been a good friend of mine at one point. But it was foolish. And I was very annoyed with my own friend who tried to make it seem like my spiritual attitude should be to just welcome him with open arms. Well, yes, if he'd been repentant, I mean, we could consider it, but still then I would keep him in a very small pen because I know what he's capable of. See, these are very important nuances of human relationship, and we can't just be naive. We can't just think, oh, we'll just, everything is beauty and light, and we'll all just be such sweet friends. No, actually. And in fact, the next section, which we might get to it tonight, is about world conditions. And there's some letters written around the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center, because there was a lot of what would I call it, fuzzy thinking in the guise of being spiritual. And Swami addressed a lot of it pretty directly. And it was all about this. You have to be realistic about what people are like. And it's not closing your heart to be realistic. And to love someone doesn't mean that you're naive. You know what you're working with. That man is still, in my own heart, he's a friend of mine, but I would keep him at a big distance. And so so I know I'm saying that because that's my own experience. I mean, later it was fun. I sort of wrote to Swami. I said, this is what happened. And none of it, as I said, was premeditated. It was just like that was just how I responded. And I wanted to confirm with Swami that was correct. Oh, he said, absolutely correct. That's what it is. You put your hand out in friendship, but you're not a fool. You put it back in your pocket if they're going to misuse what you're giving them. Then you radiate it still, but you find a more appropriate way to express it. So now here's another. This is the last letter in this section. This letter was written in 2002. Now what happened in 2002 is we had a trial, an actual jury trial for a copyright issue. And you'll have to just, I'm going to send you back. I'm not going to repeat everything, but the lawsuit that was filed in 1990 was about copyright violations, trademark violations, and exclusive ownership of the publicity rights to a deceased personality. In other words, SRF tried to say that they owned everything in relation to Master. All his words, all his pictures, everything. And we won 95% of the whole thing. But this little bit was remanded back to the jury. The judge, whose decision was reversed, said the appeals court was wrong, but they've done it, so now we have to act on it. And he said, and SRF wanted a jury trial, he said, it's a matter of copyright law. You can't, what does a jury know about copyright law? They're not qualified to weigh in balance what trained lawyers have to work hard to do, but that's what happened. So we had a jury trial on copyright law. And what fundamentally happened was, the biggest issue was that there were these the commentaries on the scripture, the Bible and the Gita, which Master wrote in the 1940s and the 1950s, were not published until after 2000, or at least well into the 90s. But they had been serialized in SRF magazines as they were being written. The only way we could get access to those commentaries was to Xerox the magazine articles and pass them out. Now, the magazine articles were in magazines that had copyright restrictions on them, so when we Xeroxed them and passed them out and sold them for cost, not for profit, we were actually printing, distributing, and selling something for which we did not have a copyright. However, the woman who was responsible for that, who was Shivani, who lives in Italy and is a very calm and forceful person, she testified magnificently that this was our scripture, and this was the only way we could get it. And then she explained, because she'd engineered the whole thing, she explained all the finances and that nobody ever made any money. She just made enough money to pay for the goods and to pay for the machine and on like that. So what happened was the jury decided that we had absolutely violated the copyright, but then there's a word called fair use. So yes, we didn't own the copyright, so we didn't have a right to do it, but what we had done was fair use, which is the same thing as saying you're not guilty. So they'd asked for $30 million in damages for that, and they got absolutely nothing. But the issue that we had 3 voice recordings of Master that were also had been remanded back for the copyright question. And that was a little more complicated because they'd been privately recorded by an individual monk of SRF. Was it his personal equipment? Was it SRF's equipment? Did he do it as part of his job as a monk? Did he really it went on and on. And the net result was it was determined that we had violated the copyright. And it wasn't considered fair use. So they'd asked for $30 million damages, and they got $30,000 on the recordings, which is one of the reasons why Ananda doesn't sell any voice recordings now. Now, I'm just going to tell you pieces of this, which are also in Lightbearer. Swamiji was the main witness for our side about the voice recordings, and his testimony was not very good. It was just sort of like, is he having a bad day? We thought maybe, are his hearing aids not working? His testimony was sort of tentative and a little bit not really clear. It was just odd. And then the judge, who had been absolutely stellar, we'd been with this judge, this was the 12th year we were working with this judge. He was superb in every way. The jury instructions on the question of the recordings were they were just garbled. They just weren't, he was crystal clear in every respect, but the jury instructions were just garbled. And when our attorney tried to get the judge to straighten them out, he wouldn't straighten them out, which was also like odd. Now, you don't have to believe all of this, but this is what I concluded. So after 12 years of litigation, it's fine, just leave it. After 12 years of litigation, SRF got $30,000 for 3 voice recordings, and we weren't allowed to sell them anymore. We were able to publish the commentary on the Rubaiyat. We were able to publish the original edition of the AY. We were able to create a whole series called The Wisdom of Yogananda. But we weren't allowed to do the voice recordings. Later, after it all came out like that, Swami said, SRF had to be able to declare victory. He said they had to be able to declare victory. They had to win something, he said, because otherwise they just never would have stopped. They needed to be able to declare that all of this has been worthwhile because we won. And that's just sort of all he said. And I thought, isn't it interesting? Because they really shouldn't have won it. But Swami didn't testify well, and the judge messed up, and so they won. And so then, at that point, SRF puts out a news release, and SRF starts telling all their members, we won, we won. You know, we were judged that we had actually violated their copyrights, and that we were using those recordings in error. So they just passed out these announcement, we won, we won. And we just thought, we don't care, guys. You can say anything you want. Because as soon as you stop trying to destroy us with a lawsuit, we have nothing, we have no other issue here. You know, we're not trying to stop you. And as soon as you stop trying to stop us, you can have your life any way you want. So with all of that in advance, Swami writes in 2002, which is the end of this, the summary is, may there be increasing harmony. And so I guess somebody had shown Swami the news release from SRF and wants to know, like, what should we do? Should we try? We also actually, that's not true. We had also sent out a news release. And it basically said, after 12 years of litigation, almost everything, and then we listed out all of the positive things that had happened as a result of the litigation and how pleased we were. Master for the world. We didn't talk about beating SRF, we just talked about liberating Master's teachings, because that was the point. And then there was I don't know really who started it, but that's what happened. So Swami says, if we want to make any reply to SRF, I suggest it be individually to those who ask. That was the decision. We'd put out what we had to say. They put out what they had to say. Basta. Here's what we might write. A reply to SRF's paper, Protecting a Spiritual Legacy, which is how they characterized what they had done, in which SRF implied that they had achieved victory in their lawsuit against Ananda when in fact 95% of the issues were decided in Ananda's favor. Well, SRF hasn't been wholly candid in their announcement. I love the way Swami says things. There was a point in the litigation, it was a big dramatic moment when this terrible lawyer that was representing Bertolucci, he was an awful, awful person. I just have to say that. In my book, Light Bearer, I never wrote his name. I just called him X. I just couldn't even put the man's name in it. And he was constantly saying untrue things, and he'd applied to the judge for a special dispensation to be able to do something, and the whole document he submitted to the judge was completely false, but we knew that he was going to do it, so we were completely ready. We'd been bamboozled a couple of years earlier, but this time we were ready. We had all the documents to prove that everything he'd written was wrong, and the judge denied his request. Then a little while later, a few years later, or whenever it was, this man did something totally unacceptable. He instructed a witness, he told the witness how to answer, he argued with the witness about what he had to say and so on. He did all of this with me listening. I mean, he did it in the open hallway, and I was standing right there. So I ran to our lawyer, and so then we get in front of the judge. And all of this is just for just a little joke. None of this is really that important. But the judge sort of, when our lawyer starts saying about what this guy has done, the judge recognizes the name. He said, is this the same man who lied on his application for thus and so? And our lawyer said, I would say he was less than candid, Your Honor. Sometimes understatement says it better. Yes, it was flagrant lies, completely self-serving. I believe it was less than candid. So Swami, again, goes it there. Well, SRF hasn't been wholly candid in their announcement. It's such a nice word. We are tired, however, of the confrontation circumstances have imposed upon us, which is, in America, if you're sued and you don't respond, you automatically lose. In other countries, the fundamental validity of the litigation can be examined right at the beginning, and if the whole thing is just frivolous, you don't have to go through it. In America, no matter what kind of garbage there is, once you're sued, you have to defend yourself or you lose by default. So once we were sued, we couldn't get out of it. We couldn't get out of it until they stopped. So again, we are tired of the confrontation circumstances have imposed on us. You see, all the things that Swami could have said. that he didn't say? You know, SRF hasn't been entirely candid, but we're tired of the confrontation circumstances have imposed upon us. Not SRF, but circumstances. It's the same truth. Swamiji he's demonstrating something here that when I finally kind of caught on to this, which was later in life than I wished I had figured it out, how you can tell the truth without being unkind. You know, it's not like, it doesn't mean, because in other places Swami's completely frank, so it depends on the circumstances, but a lot of times you can say everything you need to say without ever being accusatory or angry or insulting. You can just say it. In fact, I think it's lots of fun. I have lots of fun saying the truth without being mean. You know, it's a good mental exercise, just even to spin your mind out that way, and it's fabulous for your heart. Because all you're saying is, well, this is what people are like. You know, that's just what they're like. When so-and-so feels threatened, they do their best, you know, to get back in control. Yeah, that's just what people do, isn't it? You know, so-and-so doesn't have a very good eye for orderliness. It's a fact, but so-and-so doesn't have an eye for it. You know, it's not, you're not making it, pretending it's not true, but you're just stating it in a very impersonal way, you know? So circumstances force the confrontation. Naturally, SRF wants to show its best face. We can't really fault them for that. You know, it's just like, yeah, of course they want to look good at this point to their own members. Why would they not want to? So they're putting the best spin on it. Certain people have expressed their displeasure over their public statement, which tries to blame Ananda and make it seem as if Ananda were the loser in their lawsuit against us. I say, let people simply compare SRF's statement with ours and make up their own minds. We've been as truthful as we could, but in the end, what does it really matter? And that's another question, isn't it? What does it really matter? Because you see, now it's over. What does it really matter? The important thing is that we can now carry on without further fighting. At Ananda, and I suspect equally at SRF, there has been a huge sigh of relief now that these lawsuits are over. We can now both serve God and our line of gurus according to our own concepts of devotion and belief. Ananda hopes that we can all gradually become friends. I know that we at Ananda feel that way, and I believe many in SRF feel that way too. Communication needs to be developed between us. This has been the greatest lack. May there be increasing harmony between us in the years to come. Meanwhile, we extend our sincere love and friendship to all our Guru Bhais, our fellow disciples in SRF and everywhere. Very nice. Okay, that's what I'm going to do with that section of the book, which is not all of it, but is sufficient. So now, I will move on to this next section, which is not the last section of the book, but we're getting there. This is world conditions, which is a really interesting one to be talking about right now, isn't it? You know, all of this. So, we start right in with Master's predictions. A devotee asked, what predictions did Yogananda or other saints make about future hard times? And this is written January 9th, 2000. Swamiji put out a lot of energy when we switched, 1999 to 2000, Y2K. It came to be called year 2000, Y2K. But for those of you who didn't live through it, Y2K was a great big thing that we were living through. And Swami put out a lot of energy that there would be some cataclysmic event because of the inability of computers to cope with it being 2000 instead of 1900. None of it happened. It was a great big nothing. But what it did is it gave him a way to really activate a certain amount of practical evaluation and action about what we might need in difficult circumstances. This is another thing, just by the way. You know, I was in Los Angeles whenever, not a few years ago, and the banners on the light posts, and it wasn't a doomsday thing, it was just like, you know, are you ready for not for cataclysmic events, but in the event of earthquake or something like that, you know, do you have food, water, a few emergency supplies? Everybody just thinks now about, you ought to have emergency supplies. You need food, you need these things ready because something might happen. At the turn of the century there, it was pretty radical to be thinking like that, but now everybody just thinks like that. Oh yeah, wildfires, who knows what's going to happen? It's another one of those thought forms that's just moving through that doesn't have Yogananda's name on it, but starting in 1950, he's been talking about this. So, Master spoke of three things. A depression, which he said would make the one in the 30s look like a picnic. Now that is really a strong statement. World war, and a, quote, cataclysm. So those are the three events that Master said would happen. World wars, he actually spoke of more than one. So that means widespread violence. And of course, war nowadays would be nuclear once it begins. We've held off all these years, you know, nobody has yet used a nuclear bomb, but everybody has them. And of course that would require retaliation once it's used. I'm not being pessimistic, I'm just looking at it. Depression is also pretty easy to see for a whole lot of reasons. I won't go into it, we'll just finish the letter. He spoke of the causes of the first two, money mania, greed, and materialism for the depression. Communism and a clash of old and new values, Kali Yuga versus Dwapara Yuga, for the war. He didn't define or describe what he meant by cataclysm, but obviously ascribed whatever it will be to world karma. So we have depression because money mania has become completely out of control. We'll have war because Kali Yuga and Dwapara forces are fighting against each other. And communism, and I'll talk about this, what he means, but communism, to Master, is institutionalized atheism. I mean, the essence of Master's profound concern about communism is that it's atheistic and it places no value on individual life. It's intent upon world dominance and its system, and it has a complete disregard for individual life, because without the idea of divinity, without the idea of a creator and us all being equal manifestations of the divine, then human life is cheap. What does it mean? Only when you understand that we are here for God realization and that the infinite power itself dwells within each one of us. This is why we love one another. But once you become atheistic and there's no greater value than my pleasure, you can do anything you want. So he talks more about this later. Therese Neumann, who was a great Catholic stigmatist, stigmatist who bore the marks of Jesus on her own body, and for many years, every Friday would relive the crucifixion of Christ in vision. She was remarkable and dramatic, but she was also a profound and deep saint. She never ate or drank. She was sustained entirely directly by cosmic energy. The only thing she would ever take by mouth was a consecrated wafer, the host, in the Catholic Mass. And if the wafer wasn't consecrated, she could tell and she would spit it out. And Master went to visit her when he was going through Europe in 1935 and 36. And he writes a whole chapter in his autobiography of a yogi about her. I've read a number of other books about her, and she was in every way astonishing. Master said that she was Mary Magdalene in a previous life, which is why she continually relived the crucifixion of Jesus and was so intensely engaged in that experience. Because she was one of the disciples who stayed with Jesus every step of the way, all the way to the tomb, and she was the first to see Jesus resurrected also. Master said that was her in a previous life. So Therese Neumann also said something interesting that may touch on more than one of these points. She told an American soldier that America would suffer economic destruction as a result of the breakup of its land mass. Who can say? But that's quite interesting, isn't it? Therese certainly had a state of consciousness that causes one to want to take what she said seriously. She was very well known, and when devotees found themselves in the part of Bavaria where she lived, many people from many countries came to visit her. That's why the reference to an American soldier could even have been a soldier who came to liberate the country. Hitler knew about Therese Neumann, and Hitler was tuned in enough to spiritual power to know that she actually posed a threat to him. And it was always a little concerning for everyone as to whether or not he would act against her, but he never did. Everyone in this century whom we'd consider a saint or to have had heavenly visions, such as the many visionaries who have seen the Madonna, including Padre Pio, who also endorsed what some of the visionaries had seen, has spoken of great trials. The children of Fatima, the children of Medjugorje, the children of Garabandal, all of these were young people who had visions of Mother Mary, and in all cases, their visions included Mary telling them what have not been widely publicized, because Mary told them secrets. And she told them secrets that were about very, very difficult cataclysmic events coming to the world. So, we'll see. I mean, Garabandal and Fatima were in like 1917 and maybe in the 20s. I'm not quite sure when Garabandal was. But Medjugorje is in current times, literally, even now. It's been going on for about 30 years, but it's still going on. So this is not like ancient history. As for the first of Master's predictions, there was no specific timing on it, the Depression. However, no one seems to disagree that we are in an incredible financial bubble. No bubble in history has failed to burst in time, leaving countless people bankrupt. The people during every bubble have considered their times the exception. Yes, it always happened in the past, but it's not going to happen this time for these reasons. These are the reasons why it's not going to happen. There never has been such an exception. Moreover, it looks increasingly as if the stock and bonds market is getting too hot to last. Swami writes this in 2000. Swami started talking about, Master started talking about these predictions in 1950. Swami talked about them from the first day I met him, and he never stopped. So 70 years went by, and every year Swami would stop and ask the question, well, is this going to be the year? And he kept up with a financial newsletter, sometimes very fringe financial newsletters, because he didn't feel that from the central source you always got the whole story. And every year he was ready to see, he was always reading the signs to see if this would be the year, but not yet. So we'll see. As for war, I think people are waking up to the fact that communism is about as dead as a hibernating grizzly bear. Swami had he was very concerned about Vladimir Putin. And he says here, Putin, Russia's new boss, has eyes like a crocodile. I don't think the deaths of hundreds of millions of people would be anything more to him than an interesting statistic. What I've suspected, moreover, is that the breakup of Mother Russia has been a wound that many a Russian will simply not tolerate forever. Just a moment. The Russian mind doesn't react swiftly as the American does. The Russian broods, nurses its wounds, and awaits its opportunity, preferably until the enemy gets the idea that maybe the bear is dead after all, and walks over and bends down to take a closer look. What an image. Wow. Master spoke of communism as a very real and global threat, and not one that would simply blow away with a sea change in the economic scene. The Madonna at Fatima said the same thing in 1917 or 1918, when communism wasn't even perceived as the great threat it has since become. The same thing has been said by many others. And Swami explains elsewhere, as I explained, because it's atheistic. And it's atheism and spirituality that is the real dichotomy. And communism is the powerful atheistic governmental form where human life is cheap. Meanwhile, the old communist guard hasn't faded from power. The KGB, the Politburo, the satellite republics, all of them are the same people, merely dressed up in new clothing. The KGB is very active in, and perhaps even as, the present Russian mafia. Russia as a nation has known ruthless dictatorships for centuries. They've had no actual experience in democracy. Democratic sounds have been made and have been applauded by wishful thinkers in the West and elsewhere, but such has been the inexplicable pattern of thinking among liberals since the Russian Revolution. This is a very unpopular point of view that Swami's putting forward, especially earlier, but he never hesitated. No, I think war is definitely, here. I don't believe Master would have believed a word of the praise that has been heaped on modern Russia. It isn't modern. It's the same bear disguised as a rug. What people write of the former communist system, my thought has been, I'll believe it when I see something else actually at work. So far, the new Russia thing seems a shill. No, I think war is definitely a likelihood. Very strong words. I'm not qualified to comment, but I understand the principles behind what he's saying. I remember this would have been like in about 1991 or 1992 when whatever was happening, I don't follow history and current events that much, but that was when Russia was really changing and it was going to be this whole new era and so on. And somehow or another it was being talked about in a satsang in our church, and there was a man there who was from Bulgaria and had escaped from Bulgaria because he had been a protester, and he finally realized he was about to go to jail. So in the middle of the night, he fled. And, he was speaking from experience, and he said, those people will never give up power. He said, if you think they're giving up power, they're not. They're never going to give up power. And Swami's comment was very similar. He says, people don't just, don't just behave in a dictatorial, oppressive manner and grasp for power for themselves and then just wake up one day and say, oh, I think we won't do that anymore. He said, karma doesn't work like that. So this is what he's talking about. Master spoke of the timing of the economic crash and world war in vague terms, something like toward the end of this century. Well, we're past that end, but we're still in the same general time zone. He wrote this in 2000. I'd say we need to be very careful. Swami was living in Italy at that time. We here in Italy have gone to the American consulate in Rome and given them our email addresses. A wise precaution, I think. If an emergency arises, they'll do something to get Americans out if possible, if things don't move too fast for them. So I think I'm just going to stop there, because now we're going to go into Cataclysm, and it's several paragraphs. So I think that's enough to give us nightmares tonight. So I don't think I need to read about earth changes and the rest of us to have us all stay up and not be able to sleep. Now, I'm just going to add, just so you feel a little more cheerful, Master said the entire purpose of all of these difficulties, economic, war, cataclysm, whatever it is for one reason. It's that people need to turn to God. And he said, when all of this is washed through, he said, he spoke of Americans particularly, he said, we'll have half as much wealth and be much happier. And he's just, now, from the point of view of us, and I'll talk about this more as I go along, if the whole purpose of these hard times is to awaken us to the need for God and to motivate us to try ever more deeply to be in tune with God, why wait? Because if we are acting, if we are meeting the karma head on before it crashes over our heads, and are responding in the way that the difficulties and trials are intended to get us to respond, then the harmony of what we're doing will be a tremendous mitigating factor on the whole world, and also within whatever sphere of influence we ourselves are living in. So that's the real answer, which is love God ever more deeply. And this is a powerful motivation not to wait. God bless you, my friend.